Greetings, gentlemen. It's CS MGTOW. I have a very special guest today, Professor Glenn Geher, Director of Evolutionary Studies, Chair and Professor of Psychology at the State University of New York at New Platz. Professor Geher, it's an absolute honor to have you with us here today. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Clive. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Can you, give a bit of information about your background, how you got into this area, and what your academic and research interests are?
Sure. So I have a PhD in social psychology from the University of New Hampshire, received in the late 1990s, and the program that I was in was I guess I would call it a standard social psychology program. So we learned about studying human social behavior. We learned about statistics and research methods. We learned about renowned studies in the field of social psychology. But at some point during my education, I became extremely interested in evolutionary perspectives on human behavior and human social behavior in particular. This was largely influenced by the fact that David Buss, who's probably the best known evolutionary psychologist the world over, came to speak at the University of New Hampshire, where I was during my graduate school time. And he was extremely influential, and pretty much what inspired me about him was that he was doing social psychology research, studying human social behavior, but he was doing it from this evolutionary perspective. And what was great about that to me is that it tied everything together. So there's a simple, basic, powerful, logically coherent set of ideas that we call evolutionary theory, and we could use that to make predictions, to test things about human social behavior, and to just understand human social behavior so well that once I started digging deep into it, I concluded this was the only reasonable way to go.
For sure. And I do know, for example, Professor David Buss was, I guess, highly prolific. And he described that, evolutionary psychology as a pretty broad field of inquiry. What I've tended to see these days is that there's a lot of focus on the, the evolved behavioral sex differences, but actually evolutionary psychology is much wider than this, and that's where I would love us to kind of have our discussion today. But just before we kind of go in that direction, I do notice that I guess a certain segments of laypersons and the academic community are still quite resistant to the to the kind of premise of evolutionary psychology. Who do you tend to find, or within what group do you tend to find has the most resistance? They're conservative versus liberal, you know?
It's very interesting. This is something that I've studied very closely in my own research. Um, so I guess I'll give you a little more context and sort of give you some of my insights onto that question. I continued studying evolutionary psychology and mating from an evolutionary perspective. And when I got my academic job at the State University of New York at New Paltz, which is where I am now, I created a class called Evolutionary Psychology. And honestly, it was a great class. And students, the first time they took it, right away connected with the material, saw the kind of insights that I had about how powerful this concept is and how applicable the basic ideas of evolutionary principles are to so many different behavioral domains. So students really connected with it. But what surprised me was really palpable resistance to the entire idea from faculty, from other academics.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm like, well, you like psychology and you believe in evolution, so what gives? To be frank, it was a little bit surprising to me. And when I started to sort of um, talk to people and see, well, what's your problem with this stuff? Very consistently, the primary beef that people had with it had to do with they didn't like the research on evolved sex differences,
I
which to
see.
me is it's amazing to me because that is just a slice of evolutionary psychology. First of all, that's conceptually evolutionary psychology is anything in psychology understood from an evolutionary perspective, right? So evolved behavioral sex differences is one out of about 20,000 things that could be studied. Um, let alone the fact that all that research has given us extraordinary insights into what it means to be male versus female.
Yeah.
So it was very, very interesting. But that theme came up again and again when I sort of started looking very carefully into it. Um, I think my take on it is that most academics identify as feminists. I'd say at the very least, a large proportion of academics do.
Oh, yes.
And there's been this idea that somehow the idea of evolved behavioral sex differences is counter any feminist perspective. And
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I'm just going to say that I think that's been largely the point of friction that has made it hard for evolutionary psychologists to really advance within an academic context.
For sure. And I guess we have a very, very interesting example when Professor Larry Sumner's at Harvard pointed out that there are, very, very clear sex differences. So the majority of the kind of top echelons of, let's say, the mathematics kind of discipline, the majority of these folks are male, just because of that they're uniquely, some of these individuals are just uniquely better at mathematics. And I remember he lost his job at the time over this from Harvard. But actually, and I do also see what you, well, just from my sphere over here, that the feminists, I guess, are very, very much into the idea that men and women are identical. So any difference in outcomes must be the result of discrimination, as
Right.
opposed to, evolved behavioral sex differences.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of been the party line on that. So you have a really interesting the constellation of traits that the primary resistance has. So people are often surprised when I tell them the big resistance to evolutionary psychology is not Christian conservatives by any means. I have a conversation with people about that about once every 5 years, to be honest. Um, the resistance from what I call the far left, or this monolithic take on what it means to be a feminist academic. This is really where the resistance is. And I can give you an anecdote that was particularly influential in my thinking on this and led to one of my bigger publications, to sort of explicate this issue. We have on my campus, we have an evolutionary studies program, which features courses and visiting speakers who address issues of evolution across lots of different academic areas. And it was funded by the National Science Foundation. It's been a really exciting program to direct and to be part of. But I'll tell you, our very first speaker we had was a guy named Lionel Tiger, who's an anthropologist, the Charles Darwin endowed anthropologist at Rutgers University. And we figured he'd be an appropriate person to speak in the evolutionary studies seminar series. Well, Dr. Tiger had years prior published things about male female sex differences, and that, to be honest, it wasn't all the most politically correct stuff.
Okay.
And and he had published a couple of things. I do remember reading some of the way he worded some of the things. Maybe wasn't how I would have worded some of his ideas, but he's from a different general speech. So we bring him to campus. He's a nice guy, very established academic, and we had a we had a planned revolt against this guy that I was not aware of. He came into this his first event was supposed to be a small group discussion about the idea of evolved sex differences. Over 100 people show up. This was organized, it turns out, by faculty, not by students. They gave out these sheets. They called them fact sheets. They were not signed. There was no name on it. It had quotes of his from across his 40-year career taken with no context that just made him look like a sexist jerk. And it was unbelievable. And he looked at me like, he says, look, I've been doing this for a long time. I've never seen anything like this before. And of course I felt, of course I did not feel good about it. So that event kind of came and went, but what was a couple things interesting about it that followed, one of which is that one of our local newspapers, the Times Herald Record, ran a story on it because it was it was big enough to make some of the local news. And the author of the article just kind of described the situation as it happened, but the reader comments were incredibly interesting. I think about 17 people chimed in with their comments on it, and every single one, people didn't understand it whatsoever. So these were lay people looking at it and said, wait a minute, this guy's an academic speaking at an academic institution. They didn't let him speak. People were like real people, what I call real people, didn't get this at all. Not a single one of them said that was appropriate for them to revolt or to have this kind of thing. And it just gave me this insight into how incredibly strange the social world and the academic tower can really be. So this led me to conduct a study that I still think is one of my best publications yet, published in 2010 in Evo's Journal, co-authored with Dan Gambacorta. And what we did was a study to follow up on that experience. What we did was we had questions regarding 5 different phenomena. One was whether you think men and women are different from each other behaviorally due to nature versus nurture. One was whether you thought boys and girls were different due to nature versus nurture. One was whether you thought dogs were different than cats due to nature versus nurture. One was whether you thought non-sex difference things that are studied by evolutionary psychologists, such as the universal nature of human emotional expression or the fear of heights, due to nature versus nurture. And then a final one was whether you thought hens were different from roosters due to nature versus nurture. And we gave this scale out to a large group of academics and a large group of matched individuals who were not academics. And what we found was that for the sex difference variables, academics said this cannot be due to nature. And regular people in the other sample said, sure, this could be due to nature. But when we got to items like humans have universal emotional expressions, and everyone said, yeah, that's due to nature. When we said humans across the globe are afraid of heights, people said that's due to nature, whether they were academics or not. But then even hens versus roosters, the academics went back to their answers saying this cannot be due to nature. So certain academics, even if you're looking at other species, reject the idea that male-female differences, even in chickens, are due to anything other than social roles and social structures and this kind of thing.
I see.
So it was honestly, it was a fun study to conduct. But
incredible.
To me,
it's absolutely incredible.
It shed some light on the situation, and it made me walk away thinking, wow, people aren't against evolutionary psych. People hate the idea of evolved behavioral sex differences.
I see. Well, it almost seems that the ideology comes before the evidence, right? So it's first and foremost, I'm a feminist, we're all identical, and I'm going to ignore all of the evidence that suggests actually we have evolved sex differences, or sorry, behavioral sex differences that are evolved. And again, what I would love to find out is this, Glenn. So they accepted the utility of evolutionary psychology in understanding non-mating related phenomena such as, let's say, why do humans have a disgust for rotting food or fear of heights? But it was strictly within the evolved behavioral sex differences that they rejected the discipline.
That was 100% accurate description of the findings. Absolutely.
Oh, wow. So, I mean, for sure,
Yeah.
evolutionary psychology has to overcome this resistance. And you've kind of spoken about, you know, Evo Psych 2.0 to kind of discuss the,
Hmm.
you know, the rest of the field. So, what for you is Evo Psych 2.0?
So you know, I've been in the field for a while now, and uh, just to step back a little bit, in 2007, along with another group of like very motivated young evolutionary psychologists, we started something called the Northeastern Evolutionary Psychology Society, which is actually going to have its 10th annual conference next year. It's grown. We've had Steven Pinker, Robert Trivers, David Buss as keynote speakers. I mean, it's been really successful, and the group has ever since we started, the group has had this mission of broadening evolutionary psychology, which you know, we've always as a group known our discipline is so much more than just evolved sex differences. So that's been a major mission of mine. Now, as a follow-up to that, out of the Northeastern Evolutionary Psych Society, or NEEPS, came the Applied Evolutionary Psychology Society, which is now its own independent entity. Um, and it's really designed to take findings from evolutionary psych and apply them to issues such as mental health issues, physical health issues, political issues, and so very successful initiative. And we also had a spin-off group called FEPS, or the Feminist Evolutionary Psychology Society, which is really a group of people who are evolutionary psychologists who themselves identify as feminists and who are essentially trying to take back the concept of feminism, with this idea that, you know, you can't be an evolutionary psychologist and a feminist in the same breath, you know, being something that people in FEPS think is an inappropriate set of ideas. So I've been working with a lot of people and a lot of groups on essentially advancing evolutionary psychology in lots of positive ways for a long time. And it occurred to me the article I wrote in Psychology Today is based on all this work. And it occurred to me that we're now at a point, I think, where we can start talking about the new evolutionary psychology, or evolutionary psychology 2.0. Um, in other words, this field is the field always had a mission of being broad, of addressing lots of phenomena, and of, like any behavioral science, leading to positive social applications. But it, for various reasons, because of its large focus on sex differences early on, I think it got kind of stuck. It got caught up. It got caught up in politics. And I really think that with all these societies dedicated to positive applications of evolutionary psychology and research on evolutionary psych now that is on every possible behavioral phenomenon you can think of, I really think that it's time for people in general to reconsider um, what evolutionary psychology is, and to really embrace it as an extremely useful and positive force within academia.
Agreed wholeheartedly. What I tend to see these days, which actually does, you know, or I find rather disconcerting, is that there's a huge kind of anti-intellectual movement where, you know, it's ideology first, and then there's a kind of process of rationalization when the things we see in the environment don't match up with that ideology. And I'll give you an example. The kind of present ideology, I guess, okay, partly it's driven by the feminists, and for sure, you know, partly it's also just a kind of anti-intellectual, or, you know, kind of bent, is that, you know, boys and girls are identical, and the way we teach boys and girls, we shouldn't take into account the fact that they learn differently, they excel at different things, and then what we tend to see is that within the education system, the boys are lagging behind across
Right.
most subjects, and you know, and then of course the question is asked, you know, why are boys doing so badly? Well, we have an education system which increasingly caters to the unique ways that girls like to learn, but possibly neglects the unique way boys like to learn. And I don't see that as something deliberately malicious. I see it as coming from a place where we just assume the genders are the same, and we assume that human beings don't have evolved differences, and then we form policy based
Right.
on, and that's where it becomes very, very destructive, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. SUNY New Paltz, or State University of New York at New Paltz, where I teach, the incoming class very regularly these days is 70% female. It's a very selective, competitive school, so to get in, you have to have great grades and great test scores, and it's more and more the case that people with that background are females rather than males. Is it good for the school, for a state school, to be that imbalanced in terms of sex ratios? Probably not. But it goes back to education and our educational structures more generally. If you look at diagnosis of attention deficit problems, the ratio, I've seen different numbers, but it tends to be about 8 or 9 to 1, with males, with boys being much more likely to be diagnosed with that. Well, under natural conditions, under pre-westernized conditions, education doesn't mean you're sitting in a chair for 8 hours a day listening attentively to one grown-up who's talking to 30 people at a time. And if you look at what males do in pre-westernized societies, what boys do, they're running around all day. They're running around all day and playing games and doing X, Y, and Z. So when you force them into a room for 8 hours a day with one grown up and say, here's a pencil and here's what you do, it is so evolutionarily unnatural. I mean, it is for males and females, but particularly for boys who under natural pre-westernized conditions are much more likely to be physically active during their day. So we now have blinders on, and we see that as, wow, those people have a problem. Let's diagnose them and let's give them pills. And that's kind of outrageous when you understand evolutionary perspectives, even just a little bit. You can quickly see how unnatural our approach to education is. And there's also, like you're saying, Clive, there's this idea in education that boys and girls learn exactly the same way because they're just, except for a few anatomical differences, they're identical. And we know that that's not true.
Agree.
So I think the points you're bringing up have a lot of validity.
For sure. And what I've also noticed, and possibly you've noticed as well, is that the kind of standard emotional repertoire, as it were, is based on the female kind of emotions, or the female methods of social interaction. So when boys are naturally more kind of I guess rambunctious, and so what I then see, and I've seen quite a lot of studies, unfortunately I don't have them to hand, where the schooling system, or even society as a whole, then pathologizes these natural male emotional outlets. So boys are, for sure, we're a little bit louder, we're a little bit more kind of we get angry possibly quicker, again. And what I tend to see is that, of course, because again the assumption is, hey, boys and girls are the same. So if a boy is naturally wanting to run outside and be active and burn off a lot of energy, that's seen as him misbehaving, for sure.
Right.
For
Right.
sure.
Exactly.
And also, I would love to touch on the kind of, because those were really, really kind of interesting points in your article where you mentioned the political psychology. So how would evolutionary psychology 2.0 fit into the kind of political psychology that we have as I guess, as a Western society?
Sure. It's a good question, and I'll say there's several different movements toward political psychology right now, or evolutionary political psychology. I'll give you an example from my own research. In a recent study that's soon going to be published in the European Journal of Social Psychology, My student research team and I gave out these tasks, these politically relevant tasks, to a bunch of people, a bunch of mostly undergraduate students from various schools, and they were asked to write vignettes, to write little stories. And they either were asked to write a story about what we defined as a large-scale political situation. So we gave an example of an adjacent nation to your nation is about to implement major tariffs or something like that, versus a small scale political situation. And the example we gave was, in your class, you're in a group project and you're doing all the work, and the kid next to you got a higher grade because the teacher likes him better. So we asked people to write about large scale versus small scale political situations. And then we had these computer programs analyze the writing that people use for either large scale or small scale. And people wrote incredibly differently depending on whether they were talking about large scale politics versus small scale politics.
Wow.
Just as an example, for small scale politics, people used a much lower reading level. They actually wrote fewer sentences, but there were more words per sentence, as if they were more fluid in their writing. Um, and we interpret the findings as it was those situations were more easily cognitively accessible for them, which makes sense because if you think about politics in the sense that we talk about it now, like large scale politics, it's totally evolutionarily unnatural.
I see.
Um, Humans evolved to be in groups of between 1 and 200 individuals with a large number of kin, with the same individuals that you see over and over again. The creation of governments and states and nation states is very evolutionarily novel. Those things only have existed for a very small slice of human history. So, why are national politics bad? It's partly bad because our minds really aren't evolved to really think effectively about those kinds of things. So that would be one example of evolutionary psychology applied to modern politics.
I see. It's very, very interesting you bring that up because, of course, and I'm a layperson here, but one of the things I've started noticing is the field of neurofeminism, where I guess feminist theory and cognitive science, I guess, coalesce. And the big question there, which I would love your kind of opinion on, is there a distinctive set of feminine ethics that are different from the male ethics, and to what extent should that be driving, let's say, national policy?
It's a very interesting question. Richard Wrangham came and spoke at New Paltz one time. He's an endowed professor of anthropology at Harvard, and he's an expert on chimpanzee behavior. He used to live among the chimps years ago, and he's the first person to document warfare outside of humans. So the only other species that has been documented to show war-like behavior is chimpanzees. And it looks really similar to what we see in humans. It's
Wow.
males in one group band together, and they go after males in another group. They will do sneak attacks. They go for resources. They can be very violent, and it's an interesting analog. And then he talks about analogs in humans. And one of the things that comes out in that research, and I remember another scholar, David Livingstone Smith, once pointed this out so clearly. He said not a single war was ever primarily instigated by females.
Wow.
That this, it's a pretty bold statement. Um, but that really speaks to the very different social social patterns from males and females. So does that imply that maybe we should try to empower females in government more? That's not a science question, that's a policy question, but it certainly seems like an important implication.
For sure. And I guess also that men and women will engage in different forms of violence because men are physically stronger. men will, so for example, and I don't know if you kind of are familiar with a lot of the domestic, violence kind of stats, but men will cause more damage when they hit, and women will hit more often. And or for example, men being physically stronger may be more likely to, let's say, engage in bloody violence. But of
Mhm.
course, women having just on average less physical strength will engage in violence by proxy. So for sure, both the human male and female, there are some pretty, I guess, you know, I guess unpleasant sides to our beings as female. I'm sorry, as a humans, and we engage in different forms of violence based on the way we have to interact with the environment, as it were.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm not super familiar with that particular research, but one of the main things that evolutionary psychologists talk about is that behavioral patterns tend to map onto morphological realities.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
yeah, so large muscular men more likely to use physical violence makes a lot of sense as an example.
For sure, for sure. And in terms of using evolutionary psychology to kind of hopefully drive the kind of wider political social agenda, where would you kind of see that going?
Uh, it's a very interesting question. There are some scientists who say that science is science and policy is policy, and these need to be separate kinds of issues. I guess the way that I see it is whatever your initiatives are, whatever your goals are politically, evolutionary psychology is a very powerful tool that just sheds so much light on things. So,
Agreed.
I'm an academic in New York at this particular time. I tend to strongly side with the idea of trying to bring more money to the middle class, trying to advance healthcare, trying to advance education. I'm not saying everyone should have those same goals, but that's pretty much my large scale political take. And I think evolutionary psychology can help all of that.
For
You know,
sure. And I guess because as a tool, it's also really, really excellent for helping to predict long-term social outcomes. So if we have I guess, what is it, a set of circumstance that we place a large majority of people in, using the kind of basic underlying psychology, you really see how people will respond to that. So, and I guess an example is that, when the labor market opened up to accommodate the female half of the population, one of the things that followed very, very quickly is that the divorce rates will increase. And we're seeing that consistently around the world, that the more you mechanize and the more people move to urban settings versus rural settings, the divorce rates increase. Those are really, really excellent post in the manosphere recently by Stardust on that. And I'd just love to kind of get your take on that, as to the value of either psych as a tool or either psych 2.0 as a tool to helping us really predict how people will behave when we change the parameters, in which they live.
yeah, that's very well articulated, and I think it's a very good point. I mean, when we're about to go do some large scale change in how things go, which in our societies happen with some regularity, we got to be really careful and think quite a bit about what's evolutionarily natural and what's evolutionarily unnatural. Um, as a good example, in let's say the 50s and 60s, when major cities started putting up large buildings for residents, so large residential apartment buildings, the original ones that were put up, some of them were put up because they had some interesting aesthetics, or they looked a certain way relative to the other buildings. But the fact is that a long hallway that turns and that has 20 different apartments of people that don't really know each other, and then you have that times 100 up and down. Um, People, that doesn't really work that well. If you don't have buildings or communities that are designed in a communal way, where people have clear opportunities to know one another, to interact with one another, to build social coalitions that are positive in nature, you're going to end up running into lots of things like crime. And that's exactly what happened with a lot of the building that took place in the 1960s and 70s in places like New York and Paris and other large cities. So I think that kind of, before any large scale change is going to be implemented, stepping back and seeing, well, just a second, what were our ancestors like? What were humans evolved to do? Always a good thing. Another great example is with food production and consumption. Once agriculture came about, there became this push for thousands of years to create food that was highest in caloric content, easiest to produce, um, more likely to put fat on your bones so that in case, food was low, you had this, and so we now are experts at this. And if you go to a McDonald's or what have you around the world, you can get very cheap food that will fill you up, that will make you feel great because wow, those McDonald's burgers, man, they're something else. But what they are is it's an evolutionary trick. Um, our ancestors before agriculture evolved preferences for sweet foods, and for fatty foods. And it's precisely because those foods were rare under ancestral conditions, but drought and famine were common under ancestral conditions. And when we step back and look back now, it's so obvious that those kinds of foods, when they're done too much, create obesity, create heart problems, create type 2 diabetes. But the short-term interests and the short-term business interests in particular are often so dominant that it's so hard for people to step back and say, wait a minute, is this evolutionarily natural? Because if it's not, it might end up causing health problems.
Uh, uh,
Um,
for sure. And I guess I think you've hit on such an important point there, because the assumption usually is that, if the environment changes, the basic underlying driver will somehow go away. And actually what we're seeing is that it's intensified. So as we have mechanized as a civilization, now there's a Starbucks in every corner. People
right.
won't say, hey, hold on, I've had 2,000 calories today. Let me put a stop to this now. The kind of the basic driver to consume as many calories as possible, because there may be a famine around the corner, is still there. So just the desire just to keep on consuming is certainly going to be there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Another great example, in the field of applied evolutionary research is found in the work of Margie Prophet, who studied, pregnancy and pregnancy sickness in particular from an evolutionary perspective. And her work is considered seminal work because pregnancy sickness, or what used to be called morning sickness, when women are likely to get nauseous early on in pregnancy, for years, for decades, that was considered, um, nothing more than an adverse symptom of pregnancy that doctors should try to ameliorate. So pharmaceuticals got involved and drugs were made to simply reduce the likelihood of a woman getting sick. And after years of that, it turned out that those drugs had often deleterious effects on the developing fetus. And what Margie Prophet did was she stepped back and she looked at it and she said, well, wait a minute. If pregnancy sickness is common all around the world and has the same features, everywhere, such as eating bitter foods, happens in the first trimester, happens in pre-Westernized societies and in post-Westernized societies, this might well be an evolutionary adaptation. It may well be something that has the capacity to help people, um, advance in some kind of survival or reproductive outcomes. So what she ended up documenting very clearly is that pregnancy sickness is adaptive. It's universal because women who were likely to throw up early on when they had taken in foods that were healthy for them but had toxins at too high of levels for the developing fetus. That's exactly the condition where women are likely to get sick.
I see.
Um, and so it ended up being clearly a biological adaptation. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and again, it was the evolutionary perspective that really totally shed light on what that was all about.
For sure, because the drug in question. I mean, one of the drugs used very extensively to help prevent morning sickness. I remember it was thalidomide or thalidomide, and
Right.
and that of course had its own set of problems. With the birth defects and everything. And I completely agree with you. If I guess they had taken a look at, okay, what is the underlying driver behind here? Well, it's an adaptation to protect the fetus from foods that would, in one form or another, kind of harm the fetus. Then, for sure, all of the birth defects that then came as a result of the use of that thalidomide could have potentially been prevented. So it's such a fascinating area. It's a really, really excellent area to study, and very, very gratefully now it's starting to inform a lot of the other sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. So that to me, when we talk about evolutionary psychology 2.0, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about taking this powerful perspective that has shed light on so many different phenomena and using it to help answer these important questions about human health, human social living, human education, and so forth.
Wonderful, wonderful. This has been a very, very nice discussion. Dr. Geher, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Was there anything possibly that you wanted to kind of add to our dialogue today?
No, I just want to really express my appreciation for you having me, Clive. It's been a very pleasant conversation, and I do hope that people listening step back, think about evolution, think about its implications for who we are, and hopefully think about advancing the causes of evolutionary psychology 2.0.
For sure. Thank you. So,